The Dutch UNESCO specialist had been working in Southeast Asian cultural heritage protection for 20 years. She had attended 43 conferences in the region. She had visited Indonesia 11 times, Malaysia 7 times, Vietnam 4 times, and Thailand 6 times in her official capacity. She had never been to the Philippines. Then Manila did something that changed the regional framework for traditional knowledge protection, and she booked the next available flight. What the Philippines had done was formally document, register, and submit for UNESCO international recognition the traditional navigation knowledge of the Ivatan people of Batanes, the most complete submission of living traditional maritime knowledge in Southeast Asian heritage protection history. The submission had taken 6 years. It had been built by a Filipino maritime anthropologist named Ramon, by the Ivatan elder navigators who had agreed to have their knowledge documented for the first time, and by the specific Ambagan of a community that understood what was being lost and had decided to act before the loss became irreversible. The Dutch specialist said in an interview published by the UNESCO Cultural Heritage Division that the Philippines submission had set a regional standard that other Southeast Asian nations with significant traditional maritime knowledge had not yet matched. She specifically noted that Indonesia, the largest Austronesian-speaking nation on Earth, home to hundreds of traditional maritime communities whose navigation knowledge was as old and as sophisticated as anything documented in the Pacific, had been delaying a comparable formal documentation and recognition process for 4 decades. She said the Philippines moved. The knowledge is being preserved. The question now is whether the rest of the region will follow before the knowledge is gone. Ramon had been documenting Kapitan Domingo's navigation knowledge for 6 years before any institution had described it as significant. He had followed the old man on 17 traditional fishing voyages through the Luzon Strait and recorded the specific wind reading techniques, the current mapping methods, the star navigation protocols that the Ivatan community had been using to cross one of the most dangerous waterways in the Pacific for 5 generations. He had submitted his documentation to 3 institutions before one had agreed to support the formal UNESCO process. He had not stopped because the institutions were slow. He had stopped when the knowledge was safe. Kapitan Domingo had not changed his practice when the world started paying attention. He had not changed it when the world had not been paying attention either. He was 72 years old and had been reading the Luzon Strait by wind and current and star for 50 years. He said when Ramon told him the UNESCO recognition had come through, "Good." He said the ocean did not change. The knowledge should not change either. Now it is written down. That is also good. He went back to his boat. Welcome to Archipelago Archive. Subscribe now to join our mission of documenting the legends the world ignored. The year was 1903. The location, Paris, France, where UNESCO adopted the Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, the first international legal framework specifically designed to protect traditional knowledge, living practices, oral traditions, performing arts, and community rituals from the specific erosion that modernization, urbanization, and the death of knowledge-holding elders produced in every region of the world simultaneously. The convention was adopted by 156 nations over the following 20 decades. Indonesia, the largest archipelago nation on Earth, home to over 17,000 islands and 300 distinct ethnic groups, and some of the oldest and most sophisticated traditional maritime knowledge traditions anywhere in Asia, had ratified the convention but had not implemented a formal documentation and submission process for its traditional maritime navigation knowledge as of the time this account was written. The Philippines, with a fraction of Indonesia's geographic scale and population, had completed one. The specific reason the 40-year gap existed was not Indonesian indifference to traditional knowledge. Indonesia had produced some of the most significant scholarship on traditional maritime knowledge in the Bajo people of Sulawesi, the Bugis seafarers of Makassar, the traditional navigation communities of the Banda Sea and the Flores Sea, carried navigation knowledge that was as old and as sophisticated as anything in the Pacific. The gap existed because of institutional complexity. Indonesia's federal structure, its 300 ethnic groups with competing claims on cultural recognition, its political history with regional autonomy, and the specific challenge of identifying which traditional maritime knowledge community would form the first formal submission in a nation where every province had a competing claim of equal validity. The system had made the decision impossible by making it too large. The Philippines had made it possible by starting with one island, one elder, one researcher, and 6 years of patient work.
Ramon had chosen Batanes specifically because it was the most geographically isolated community in the Philippine archipelago, and therefore the one where traditional navigation knowledge had been least disrupted by modernization. Batanes sat at the northern edge of the Philippines, separated from the next Philippine province by over 200 kilometers of open ocean, exposed to the full force of the Luzon Strait and the Pacific Typhoon Belt in a way that had required the Ivatan community to develop navigation knowledge of extraordinary precision and reliability. The Ivatan had been navigating the Luzon Strait without instruments as long as the oral record extended. Their wind classification system alone, the specific Ivatan vocabulary for the 32 distinct wind patterns of the Luzon Strait, was a body of knowledge that took years to learn and that no outside institution had documented before Ramon arrived with his notebooks and his voice recorder and his commitment to stay until he understood what he was hearing. To understand why the Philippines submission became the regional model rather than simply one national submission among many, you have to understand what the Ambagan principle produced in the 6 years of work that built it. Ramon had not worked alone. The formal documentation process had required a specific collaboration between the University of the Philippines, the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, the Ivatan Council of Elders, the Batanes provincial government, and the individual elder navigators who had agreed to have their knowledge recorded for the first time. Each institution and each person had brought a specific contribution that the others could not provide. The university brought the academic framework. The NCCA brought the institutional recognition. The Council of Elders brought the authority to approve the documentation. The elder navigators brought the knowledge. And Ramon brought the 6 years of relationship building that had made all the others willing to sit in the same room and trust the same process. Kapitan Domingo had not agreed to the documentation immediately. Ramon had spent the first 2 years of the 6 in building the relationship that made the agreement possible. The Ivatan elders had specific and well-founded concerns about what happened to traditional knowledge when it was documented and removed from its community context, whether the documentation would replace the living transmission of the knowledge through the traditional apprenticeship process, whether the written record would become the authoritative version that diminished the authority of the living practitioners, and whether the institutional recognition process would result in the community losing control of knowledge that had been theirs for generations. Ramon had addressed each concern specifically and had agreed to a set of documentation protocols that the Ivatan Council of Elders had developed, protocols that specified what could be documented publicly, what could be documented in restricted access archives, and what would remain exclusively in the oral tradition and would not be transcribed at all. If you believe in the untapped power of the Philippines, hit that subscribe button. It helps us find more stories like this one. The Dutch UNESCO specialist had reviewed 43 traditional knowledge submissions from across Southeast Asia and the Pacific in her 20-year career, She had a specific professional framework for evaluating them: the comprehensiveness of the documentation, the community consent protocols, the institutional support structure, and the sustainability plan for the continued transmission of the knowledge within the community alongside the formal archival record. The Philippine Ivatan submission had received the highest scores she had given in 20 years across all 4 categories. She said in her published review that what made the submission exceptional was not the quality of the documentation alone, though the quality was exceptional, but the specific community ownership structure that Ramon and the Ivatan Council of Elders had built. The community was not the subject of the submission, it was the author.
The Dutch specialist had arrived in Manila on a Tuesday morning in the dry season. Ramon had met her at the airport. He had not expected her to want to go to Batanes immediately, but she had. She had said, "I have read the submission. I need to see where the knowledge lives." They had taken the 45-minute flight from Manila to Basco, the capital of Batanes, and driven from the airport to the Batan Island shore, where Kapitan Domingo kept his traditional vessel. The Dutch specialist had stood at the shore and looked at the Luzon Strait for a long time. She said later that standing at the edge of the water, where the traditional navigation knowledge had been developed across generations, made the submission documents she had read in The Hague feel different in her body than they had felt on paper. She said, "I understood the knowledge when I read it. I felt the urgency of protecting it when I stood at the water." Ramon had introduced her to Kapitan Domingo the following morning. The 3 of them had spent 5 hours on the Batan Island shore, with Ramon translating between Ivatan and English, while Kapitan Domingo walked the Dutch specialist through the wind classification system, not from the documentation, but the actual morning wind on the strait. He named each wind pattern as it appeared, described its direction and its duration, and what it meant for navigation, and demonstrated the specific physical reading technique, the angle of the face to the wind, the specific pressure against the skin that distinguished one pattern from another, that no documentation had been able to fully capture because it existed in the body of the practitioner rather than on any page. The Dutch specialist had listened for 5 hours without taking a single note. She said later that she understood for the first time in 20 years of professional work why the community had specified that some of the knowledge would remain exclusively oral. She said, "The wind cannot be transcribed, it has to be felt." But what happened when the Dutch specialist returned to The Hague and published her full evaluation of the Philippine Ivatan submission, and what she included in that evaluation that she had never included in 20 years of previous reviews, the specific section she had written on the flight home and revised 3 times before she was satisfied it said what she had understood standing at the Batan Island shore, was what made the Philippines not just a national achievement, but a global heritage protection model. Stay with me. The section she had added to the evaluation was titled "The Embodied Knowledge Problem and the Limits of Documentation." It described, in the institutional language of UNESCO Cultural Heritage Protection Policy, what she had experienced at the Batan Island shore, that traditional navigation knowledge of the specific type the Ivatan possessed contained components that formal documentation frameworks were structurally unable to capture because they existed in the body of the practitioner and could only be transmitted through direct physical contact with the environment that produced the knowledge. She argued in the published evaluation that the Philippine Ivatan submission's decision to designate certain knowledge as exclusively oral was not a limitation of the submission, but its most important methodological contribution, because it acknowledged the limits of documentation frameworks honestly and built a protection model around the living transmission of embodied knowledge rather than treating documentation as sufficient.
She recommended that the UNESCO framework revise its submission guidelines to include a specific category for embodied knowledge that could not be fully documented. The revised guidelines were adopted the following year.
The Ambagan that Ramon had assembled across 6 years had not ended when the UNESCO submission was complete. It had become the foundation for a national traditional knowledge protection program that the Department of Education and the NCCA had jointly developed using the Batanes model as its template. The program had been piloted in 7 additional Philippine provinces in the 3 years following the UNESCO recognition. Documentation projects in Palawan for the Tagbanwa maritime knowledge tradition, in the Sulu archipelago for the Tausug navigation knowledge, in Davao for the Bagobo oral ecological knowledge, and in Ifugo for the rice terrace agricultural knowledge that the Cordillera communities had been maintaining for 2,000 years. Each pilot had adapted the Batanes model's community consent protocols to its specific community context. Each had produced a submission package that the NCCA had archived and that Ramon's documentation team had used as the basis for a national traditional knowledge atlas that did not exist before the Batanes project began. Kapitan Domingo had been asked to travel to Manila to receive a formal commendation from the NCCA for his contribution to the Batanes documentation project. He had declined. He had sent Ramon in his place with a specific message for the NCCA, which Ramon had read at the commendation ceremony in Kapitan Domingo's exact words. He said that the knowledge was not his to receive recognition for. He said the knowledge belonged to the Luzon Strait and to the generations of Ivatan navigators who had learned it from the strait before him. He said recognizing him for the knowledge was like recognizing a vessel for the sea it had crossed. He said the sea did the work, the vessel simply had to be strong enough to cross it. He thanked the NCCA for protecting the knowledge. He said, "Now teach it to the young ones. That is the only recognition the knowledge needs." Ambagan, the collective contribution of everyone who has something to bring. The Ambagan that Ramon had assembled in Batanes had not been a research project. It had been a decision that a specific knowledge was worth protecting before it was gone, made by a community of people who each had one piece of the solution and who trusted each other enough to put their pieces together. The Dutch specialist had brought the international framework. Ramon had brought the 6 years of relationship building. The Ivatan Council of Elders had brought the authority to approve the documentation. Kapitan Domingo had brought the knowledge, and the knowledge itself, the 32 wind patterns of the Luzon Strait, the star navigation protocols, the current reading techniques that the Ivatan had been developing for 5 generations in one of the most demanding maritime environments in the Pacific, had brought what it had always brought, the specific proof that the Philippine archipelago had been producing sophisticated civilizations long before any outside institution had arrived to recognize them. The Dutch specialist had published a second piece in the UNESCO Cultural Heritage Division's journal the year after her full evaluation, not an institutional review, but a personal reflection titled, "What a Batanes Elder Taught Me About the Limits of My Own Framework." It described, in direct and non-institutional language, the 5 hours at the Batan Island shore, and what she had understood there that 20 years of professional evaluation had not taught her in any office. It ended with a statement that Ramon had read on his phone in Batanes, and then shown to Kapitan Domingo, who had asked what it said. Ramon had translated it. Kapitan Domingo had listened. Then he had said, "That is correct." He had gone back to his boat. He had not said anything else because there was nothing else to say. The Dutch specialist had arrived at the Luzon Strait, and the Luzon Strait had taught her the same thing it had been teaching the Ivatan for 5 generations. The lesson did not change for the student's nationality. The Philippines did what Indonesia had not done in 40 years.
It did it because one researcher spent 6 years at one island with one elder until the knowledge was safe. The Ambagan. Everyone brings what they have. Nobody waits for the perfect moment to begin. Every island holds a secret. Every barangay has a legend. Subscribe and stay close. Next, we uncover another story that you will enjoy. Tell us in the comments, which Filipino legend should we unearth next?